Okay, we're in Genesis chapter 21 this evening. We saw last week in the earlier part of chapter 21 dealt with the birth of Isaac, the long-promised son that God had promised to give to Abraham and Sarah. So we had finally the fulfillment of that promise with the birth of Isaac. Then following on from that was the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham's household, but the promise that God made to make of Ishmael a great nation as well. So we come to the final verses in chapter 21 here, from verse 22 down to verse 34. And we go back to a character who we met in chapter 20, and this is Abimelech. And we've got the account here of Abraham's covenant with Abimelech in chapter 21, verses 22 to 34, which says that the commander of his army said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity. But as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned." And Abraham said, "I will swear." When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, "I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today." So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 new lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 new lambs which you have set apart?" He said, "These 7 new lambs you will take from my hand, that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well." Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So we have another incident here involving Abraham and Abimelech. Abimelech is the king of Gerar, and we met him in chapter 20. So Abraham is approached by Abimelech, the commander of his army, who is named Phicol. Abimelech had noticed Abraham's prosperity and that God was with him in all that he was doing. And so he seeks to establish a peaceful relationship with Abraham. And this really illustrates what a wealthy and powerful figure Abraham must have been, and how God was blessing him and keeping that promise to bless him, which God had made originally to Abraham way back in chapter 12. Abraham's life was a testimony to God's presence in all that he was doing. So Abimelech asks that Abraham swear by God that he will not deal falsely with him or his descendants, but he says, "As I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and the land where you have sojourned." So Abimelech considers that he had dealt kindly with Abraham following the incident with Sarah, and he had, after which he had invited Abraham to dwell wherever he wished in the land. Now he asks that Abraham should deal with him in the same way, so a like for like arrangement. You deal with me as I have been dealing with you. And Abraham agrees to Abimelech's proposal here and says that he will swear, he'll swear an oath that he will do this. So this agreement then would be beneficial to both parties. It would guarantee security for both of them. But having agreed to make this covenant, then Abraham raised an issue with Abimelech, a complaint concerning a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And this matter needed to be dealt with before this covenant could be sealed. But Abimelech said that he's not heard anything about this matter. He doesn't know anything about it, this well. And Abraham hadn't mentioned anything about it before either. wells and supplies of water were, of course, very important in that region, a dry region where there's not much rainfall, and to lose a well, to lose access to a well, would be a serious matter. So the covenant between Abraham and Abimelech was sealed by Abraham presenting sheep and oxen to Abimelech, perhaps being used in the offering or the sacrifice that would be made when a covenant was being ratified. And then, in addition, Abraham also set aside 7 ewe lambs. And Abimelech asked him about these ewe lambs, what all this was about. And Abraham's reply was in verse 30 here, "These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well." And so Abimelech's acceptance of the lambs then showed his agreement that Abraham had dug the well and therefore had a rightful claim to it. And these lambs would also perhaps be a sort of form of payment or compensation for Abimelech for the loss of this watering place for his own flocks. The place where all of this happened was given the name Beersheba, as we learn in verse 31. You can see the location of it in the red circle there on the map. And the name Beersheba, we're told, means the well of the 7, which perhaps a reference to the 7 lambs, or the well of the oath, which is where they had made this oath with each other. So the 2 men swore an oath and so established this covenant between themselves. And when all of that was settled, then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, returned to the land of the Philistines, which is more along the coast there. You can see Gera on the map there, just outside of that red circle as well, which is where Abimelech is based. So that's the land of the Philistines. And then Abraham, we're told, planted a tamarisk tree there at Beersheba, and he called on the name of the Lord, Yahweh, called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. That phrase, everlasting God, in Hebrew is El Olam, and Olam is a word that means everlasting or eternal. It's an indication of the eternal existence of God, that God has always existed. This is another name for God that we can add to the growing list of names that are applied to God. Back in chapter 14, verse 22, God was referred to as Most High, or El Elyon. And in chapter 17, verse 1, he was spoken of as being God Almighty, or El Shaddai. So another name here, the everlasting God, the eternal God, is being applied to him. So all of these names that are used of God indicate something of his character and his nature. So the incident concludes here by telling us that Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So this covenant made with Abimelech allowed Abraham to dwell securely and unthreatened there in that part of the land, and so he stayed there for a long time, we're told. Move on into chapter 22, and we have the wonderful story here of the testing of Abraham's faith and the offering of Isaac. And so we're going to read here chapter 22, verses 1 to 8 to begin with. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here am I." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the ass. I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. Abraham's faith is about to be put to the supreme test when God asks him to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering. The story raises a number of questions in our minds. Why would God command a human sacrifice when later human sacrifices were explicitly forbidden by God? Why would God ask such a thing of Abraham when Abraham had waited so long for this son? Why did not Abraham plea for Isaac to be spared as he had pleaded for the people of Sodom? Why was Abraham willing to make this human sacrifice? Isaac is the son of the promise through whom Abraham was to have many descendants. So why is God now asking Abraham to sacrifice him? If Isaac is killed before he has any children of his own, then how is that promise going to be fulfilled? So questions like this arise in our minds when we perhaps consider this incident. But we're told at the start of the story that after these things, so referring back to the events of chapter 21, that God is to test Abraham. After these things, God tested Abraham. We all know what's about to happen. We've read the story, and we know that it will be a test of Abraham's faith. But at this point, Abraham doesn't know what's going to happen. To Abraham, this is simply a commandment of God which must be obeyed. If God has full knowledge about everyone, then why does he need to test people in this way? There are other occasions when we are told that God tested people as well. Later on in Exodus chapter 15, with the Israelites in the wilderness at that time, we're told that God tested them, their willingness to obey him. In Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 speaks of Moses leading Israel through the wilderness of Shur, and there's no water, and the people are murmuring and complaining that there's no water to drink. And Moses cries to the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. And we're told in verse 25 here, there the Lord made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them, or tested them, saying, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give heed to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases upon you, which I put upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. In chapter 16, verse 4 as well of Exodus, again, God is testing the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or not. So other occasions that we come across where God is said to be proving people or testing people, testing their willingness to trust him, their willingness to obey him. So God tests or tries or proves people in this way to help them to develop and to grow in their faith and their trust in him. The Authorized Version translates verse 1 here as God did tempt Abraham. And the one word can be translated either as tempt or test, depending upon the context in which it is being used. So God does not tempt people to try to make them fail or fall, but he does test people in order to strengthen them and to help them to grow. It is Satan who tempts us to try to bring out the evil in us, but God tests us in order to bring out the good in us. So God calls to Abraham by name, and Abraham immediately answers. Abraham, God calls, and Abraham answers, here am I. And Abraham's reply indicates his willingness to listen, his willingness to do whatever God asks of him. And God then gives Abraham these specific instructions: take his son Isaac, go to the land of Moriah, and offer Isaac as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which God will identify. And God emphasizes the special relationship that Abraham has with Isaac by saying to him, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. So there's a sort of increase in intensity in those words. So take your son. Well, not your son, he's your only son. You're not your only son, he's the son whom you love. So God is emphasizing this special relationship that Abraham has with Isaac. So God is going to ask Abraham to give that which is most precious, which is most valuable to him. So it's to go to the land of Moriah, but the location of the land of Moriah is unknown. The only other reference to Moriah is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1, where Solomon, we're told, began to build the temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, which this has led some to believe that Mount Moriah in Jerusalem was the site of Abraham's offering up of Isaac, but we cannot be certain about that. So God asks Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering, which Abraham would have understood to be a sacrifice that was to be consumed by fire. God's command to Abraham is direct and straightforward. It leaves no room for debate or discussion. God simply tells Abraham what he needs to do. And Abraham was willing and eager to obey, and so early the next morning he prepared for the journey. He saddled his ass, he took 2 of his young men, his servants, along with Isaac, and he cut the wood that would be used in the burnt offering. And this small group then departed for the land of Moriah, where God had said that they were to go. And it was on the 3rd day, so it had taken 3 days to get there, that Abraham saw in the distance the place where they were destined to go. It really must have been, I suppose, a somber journey for Abraham, because he alone of the group knew what was to happen when they reached their destination. As they got nearer to the place, Abraham instructed the 2 young men to stay behind with the ass, whilst he and Isaac continued on in the journey. He says to them in verse 5, I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. Abraham's words there express his confidence that perhaps both he and Isaac would return. He said, we will go and worship and come again to you. So Abraham gave Isaac the wood to carry, whilst Abraham took in his hand the knife that would be used to kill the offering, and also the fire to set the offering alight. So the 2 of them headed off together for this place that God had directed them to. And now Isaac speaks for the first time. These are the first words of Isaac that we have heard. My father, he says. And Abraham answers, here am I, my son. Isaac has noticed that there's something missing. Well, we've got the fire here, we've got the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham then reassures him.
Write 5 examples for facts.
God will provide himself the lamb for the
means
Abraham's words again reflect his hopefulness that somehow Isaac would not have to be offered. He says, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And so the 2 of them then continue on their journey. Abraham is obeying God, whilst Isaac is obeying his father. Verse 9 to verse 14 then continues the story. We see what happens next. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. When they arrived at the place God had directed them to, Abraham went through the steps of preparing to make this sacrifice. So he built an altar, he laid the wood in order on the altar, and then he bound Isaac, tied him up, and laid him upon the wood. Isaac could have resisted at this point, but he was submissive to his father. And we may wonder what was going through his mind at this point. And Abraham then stretched out his hand. He took the knife in readiness to slay Isaac. But before Abraham can go through with this, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. There's an urgency here in the repetition of Abraham's name. And Abraham answered, as he had done at the beginning of the story, Here am I. Here am I. I'm ready to listen. And the angel of the Lord said to Abraham, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham's willingness to carry through this command to offer Isaac shows his fear of God. He has been tested and he's passed the test. And now when Abraham looked around behind him, he saw this ram that was caught in a thicket by its horns. And so he took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And then we're told that Abraham named that place, The Lord Will Provide, or The Lord Will See to It. And again, another name of the Lord here is Yahweh Yireh, or Jehovah Jireh, because the Lord had provided the ram as the substitute for Isaac. And then this gave the saying commonly used at that time, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. It seems to have been a sort of proverb that developed, that people were saying as a result of that the Lord would provide. The writer to the Hebrews refers to this incident as an example of Abraham's faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 to 19. Where he writes, By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom it was said, Through Isaac shall your descendants be named. He considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. Hence, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. The writer there explains that Abraham was prepared to slay Isaac because he believed that if he did so, God would raise Isaac back from the dead, so that the promise made to Abraham concerning his descendants would be fulfilled. Isaac had to live. He had to stay alive so that that promise could be fulfilled. But Abraham's faith was such, well, if I have to go through this and kill him, God is going to bring him back. God will raise him back to life again. And this was the strength of Abraham's faith, that he took God at his word. He believed in that promise, that original promise that God had made concerning his descendants. And so when God told Abraham to do something, he did it without question. His trust in God was complete. The incident is also referred to by James in the New Testament as well, in James chapter 2, verses 21 and 22, in order to show how Abraham's faith was demonstrated or completed through his works. So James chapter 2, verse 21, he says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac upon the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by works. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." So it's a great example of Abraham's faith, a great demonstration of his faith here. Then verses 15 to 19, God repeats the promise of the blessing for Abraham. Verse 15 to 19 of Genesis 22 says this, "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you and will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your descendants shall all the nations of the earth bless themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. The angel of the Lord now speaks to Abraham for a second time, and the Lord swears by himself that since Abraham has done this and has not withheld his son, then the Lord shall bless him and multiply his descendants. There is no more solemn oath that can be made than the Lord swearing by himself. A number of examples of that are given as well in other places, in Exodus chapter 32, verse 13, in Isaiah 45:23, in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 5, which all speak of God swearing by himself. And in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 to 15, the writer there refers back to this incident with Abraham as well, and this God swearing this oath. Hebrews 13, chapter 6, verse 13, the writer says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, Surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently endured, obtained the promise." So the Lord swearing by himself indicates the absolute certainty of all of this happening, that God's word can be trusted and relied upon without any question or doubt. And this here is a confirmation of the earlier promises that God had made. God is simply repeating once again these promises that he's made to Abraham concerning his descendants, that they would be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand on the seashore, and they will be successful in possessing the gates of their enemies, so their enemies would be defeated. The blessings will come to Abraham, to his future descendants, and to all the nations of the earth, God says, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham's obedience has consequences, worldwide consequences, for others as well. Abraham and Isaac then returned to the two young men who had been left behind to look after the ass, just as Abraham said they would. "We'll go off and worship," he said, "and we'll come back to you." And he did. And the whole party then returned together to Beersheba, where Abraham continued to dwell. And it must have been quite a different journey going home than it had been on that outward journey. It must have been a return journey of great joy. The final few verses of chapter 22 here concern some family news that Abraham receives concerning his brother. In verse 20 to 24 Now after these things it was told Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. So Abraham receives news, family news concerning his brother Nahor, who was mentioned way back in chapter 11, verses 27 to 29, when we were given the family tree, genealogy of Abraham there, that the descendants of Terah, Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot, and Haran died prematurely there before his own father. So Nahor's wife is named Milcah, and she has borne 8 children, and their names are listed there. The one who is of most interest to us is Bethuel. He's mentioned here because he became the father of a daughter named Rebekah. And it's also noted here that Nahor's concubine, named Reumah, also bore him 4 children, so 12 children there. So the main purpose in recording this little bit of family history is really to introduce us to Rebekah and show where she fits in with the family tree, as she will become Isaac's wife, as we will see in chapter 24 and verse 15, which says, before he had done speaking, behold, Rebekah was born to Bethuel, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar upon her shoulder. But that's a story for another time. So thinking over the verses that we've looked at this evening, the stories here, the few questions we might like to think about. How would you describe the relationship between Abraham and Abimelech? We've met Abimelech a couple of times. What was their relationship like? What is the difference between being tested and being tempted? How did Abraham demonstrate his faith? And what do we learn about the nature of faith from this story of Abraham and Isaac? So a few questions there for us to think about, but we'll stop there for this evening. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments, then please feel free